Welcome to another Engage MH webinar. I'm Rich Buchanan from the Moet Hennessy Brand Education team. Today, we thought we would share with you a training that we've been doing for some markets, and it's a very brief overview of the Champagne region. And what I like about this training is, in my mind, it kind of lays the groundwork for Champagne before we kind of deep dive into one of our maisons. So what I did was I sat down and I came up with kind of 11 little facts, 11 little points about Champagne that I think you need to know before you start kind of discussing our brands. So this is not a full Champagne 101, but this is 11 things I'd like you to know about Champagne. Number one, the size. I think this is something we always need to remember, and I think when we're talking to, say, consumers or the trade or anyone, always keep this in the back of your mind that the Champagne region itself is tiny. In terms of production of wine in the world, Champagne is about 0.6%. 0.6% of wine produced in the world is Champagne. So we're always dealing with this very small region. Number two, location. As we all know, the Champagne region is the only region in the world legally that should be producing wine that has the word Champagne on the label. This region is in the northeast of France, near the German and Belgian borders, and it is traditionally for France kind of the furthest north for growing grapes. That's changing a tiny bit, but traditionally that's always been about as far north as you go for growing grapes. What's interesting, if you look at it in comparison to the United States, and you look at it in terms of latitude, you'll see that the Champagne region, and we'll kind of not count Alaska right this second. I love Alaska. But if we just look at the continental United States, we'll see that the Champagne region is further north than the entire United States. So it is amazing to think about growing grapes, maybe say in Newfoundland in Canada. Of course, it's very moderate and mild on the West Coast in Canada. But it is showing this does show that we're dealing with a region that is fairly far north. So that's going to, some weather issues will come along with that. Number three, difficult terroir. I mean, we've already talked about this location in the northeast of France. We have a soil, and you're all familiar with, of course, the chalk soils that they love all over the world, but especially here in the Champagne region. And it is amazing to think about, there are plants that, their root systems are growing down into this chalk. Chalk is nutrient poor, would be an understatement. Imagine taking chalk from the classroom and grinding it up and then putting it into a flower pot and then trying to grow something in that. It is like I said, nutrient poor soil, but what they love about it in the Champagne region especially is that it does act like a sponge. And so it holds that moisture, that water, and every now and then when they have almost like a drought situation, those vines are able to get that moisture out of the chalk. This was a fun quote from the documentary. It's on Netflix called A Year in Champagne. Champagne has the best of both worlds, the worst weather and the worst soil. Frost is a big issue in the spring. If you're reading these harvest notes for Champagne vintages, you'll see always mentions of spring frost. 2004 was an odd example in that there was no frost in the springtime. Spring frost can, completely damage, destroy vines for an entire village, so it can be devastating. They have issues with powdery mildew. They have issues with botrytis. Botrytis is something they do not want in the Champagne region. It does not work the same way as it might in Sauternes. This does not make awesome wine in the Champagne region. So we try to avoid botrytis. And that is an issue in a region where you have 200 days of rain per year, lots of moisture. Hailstorms traditionally will hit, if they do, in the fall. And they can completely wipe out villages. You can see in that middle photograph, that's actually damage from hail. Those kind of cuts in the vine. So this is a major, major issue. We've had vintages where winemakers have said, I need to wait one more day or another week for the fruit to be ripe. and they've had this, this chance of hailstorms, of big storms coming through, and it is a real gamble because, like I said, these storms can just wipe out your entire vineyard if you're not careful. Number 4, the primary grapes. We all know this. The 3 primary grapes, 99.9% of Champagne is produced using these 3 grapes, or at least one of these 3 grapes. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Meunier. Pinot Noir is the most planted vine in the Champagne region, and Pinot Noir brings some kind of red fruit notes, but to me it brings the structure, if you will, the body of the wine. Meunier, 31% of the plantings are Meunier, and we talk about kind of more stone fruit, peaches, pears, in terms of the flavor profile, but to me it brings this kind of supple, fleshy character to the wine. And then Chardonnay, also 31% in terms of plantings in the Champagne region. Chardonnay in the Champagne region tends to be very high tone. So it's white floral, it's citrus, very bright. They interact very nicely together. You look at a wine like Moet and Chandon's Imperial, and it's got the structure, the framework, if you will, the skeleton from the Pinot Noir. The Meunier is the meat on that bone. And then the Chardonnay is there to kind of brighten all those flavors up. Number 5, year-round manual harvests. Working in the Champagne region is not easy. Most everything is being done by hand. You're working these vineyards year-round. The wintertime can be quite difficult, quite chilly, a little bit snow. When we're talking about manual labor, to me, one of the most interesting things is the fact that the grapes have to be hand harvested. So this is by law. And what this allows in this environment that can be very tricky, and you can have very different ripeness situations within a row, within a vineyard, it allows you to do multiple passes through these vineyards and really, cherry pick, literally cherry pick, if you will, the correct bunches from these vines. Moet and Chandon will hire, on average, about 3,000 people every year to come in and harvest the fruit. They will keep them for maybe a week, maybe 2, maybe 3. They'll pay them room and board. It is a huge investment to just get that fruit off the vine. Number 6, the luxury of time. In the Champagne region, I would say this as well, I think in the Cognac region, but time is this huge factor. I love this little timeline. Let's pretend that, we're September 2018. It's September 2018. We've gone out, we've harvested our fruit. If we're in Italy making Prosecco, our Prosecco will be ready, about 3 or 4 months after that. So we could easily have something ready in December. If we're in Spain, in Cava, we're probably looking at December of 2019. So, a little over a year and a quarter after harvests is kind of the earliest point when we would have Cava ready. If we're making Moet and Chandon, and this, I'm realizing that this time frame is conservative. We could start thinking about having this wine ready in September 2020. We know that Moet usually sees about 2 years on the lees, and then a few months of bottle age before being released. So 2020 of September would be aggressive to get that bottle out, but it's good for the illustration. It's September 2021, so 3 years minimum, we would start seeing those bottles of Clicquot, Yellow Label, or Ruinart, the Blanc de Blanc. And then with Krug, honestly, this would probably really apply more to the vintage. So the vintage Krugs can be anywhere, 10, 12, 14 years at time of age before they get released. So, September 2028 is maybe when we might think about seeing a vintage of Krug. And for Dom Perignon, their goal is anywhere from 8 to 9 to 10 years. And so maybe September 2026, we might start thinking about seeing the vintage of Dom Perignon. The bottom line is, time is really the most valuable thing in the world. And the time that these wines spend in the cellar on the lees, they get more complex, they get more depth, they get more magical. And to me, like I said, this is the most valuable aspect in the world. We can talk about a fancy bottle, a fancy package, but at the end of the day, this is the most valuable thing, this patience that these champagne winemakers have. Number 7, base wines versus reserve wines. You'll see mentions of this, of course, through many of our presentations and our tech sheets and all that fun stuff. But this is basically, so we're all on the same page here, when we're talking about a non-vintage champagne. So non-vintage being made for multiple years. The base wines are traditionally the wines that are from the current harvest. So if I'm making Moet and Chandon Imperial, the wines that I just harvested from the past September, I would probably refer to those as my base wines. And for Moet and Chandon, the base wine ratio is pretty high. The majority of that wine in that bottle is quote unquote base wines. And then reserve wines. Reserve wines are wines from our cellar that they bring in to kind of round out, to balance out the blend. And so reserve wines are from previous years. Of course, with Dom Perignon, this is not a conversation because they're a vintage wine. And Krug Grand Cuvée is a little tricky because in many cases, the base wine, the quote unquote base wine, may be a small percentage. It may be, majority reserve wine. It's a little complicated there. So we don't traditionally really talk about base wines, reserve wines with Krug Grand Cuvée. Number 8, second fermentation in the bottle. You're thinking, oh, I know this, but the thing is, I feel like our customers and consumers may not realize this. So let's always make sure that people understand that, champagne, the magic of champagne, the bubbles are not being made. It's not being made in a big stainless steel tank. We're not injecting bubbles into the bottle. That second fermentation happens in the bottle that they're holding in their hand. Number 9, rosé and red wine. I think for Americans, we still think about rosé as being a sweet wine. We've got to kind of work on that. I always say, probably 98% of the time, if it's a rosé from the Champagne region, it's a very, very good chance it's going to be a very dry wine. So these wines tend to be dry, and they also tend to be some of the greatest food pairing wines in the world. And within our portfolio, we have two icons, if you will. Clicquot, that really started the idea of using Pinot Noir and blending Pinot Noir to make rosé. And the first time they did that was in 1818. And then on March 14th, 1764, Ruinart launches the first rosé in the Champagne region. Not made via blending with red still wine. We're not exactly 100% sure how that rosé was made, but the very first time we have rosé showing up in the Champagne region in 1764 at Ruinart. Number 10, number of bubbles in a bottle. We don't need to know this, but it's a fun factoid. 49 million bubbles in a bottle of champagne. If you're talking to someone and maybe they're balking at the price, you're talking about, oh, this Clos Ambonnet or Clos Menil from Krug is X, hundreds of dollars. If you figure out the ratio of, what, each bubble in that bottle costs, it's a pretty good deal if you think about it that way. So 49 million bubbles in the bottle of champagne. And then number 11, last but not least, how to open a bottle of champagne. Everyone needs to know this. Especially for our wait staff, we need to make sure they understand and they feel comfortable opening a bottle of champagne. I always tell them, we don't need a wine key. We don't need the knife on the wine key to take the foil off. We spend a lot of time making sure that this foil comes right off very easily with a little pull tab. Really the only wine, at least in our portfolio, that this does not apply to, of course, is Dom Perignon. And with Dom Perignon, you literally just stick your finger right through the foil and pull out the little loop for the cage. Don't try to peel off that foil. It will not come off. As soon as you start messing with the cage, you have a thumb, a hand on top of that bottle. You don't point it at anybody. If you're wondering, yes, this is our holiday card. You always have that hand on top of that bottle. And then to me, the key key thing I learned very early on about champagne was, you know, you have it at a 45-degree angle, that hand that's on the top of the bottle doesn't move, and you're turning from the bottom, and then the pop. That's it. That's 11 things I wanted you to know about champagne. Yay. Thanks. We'll see you again.